My husband threw me out of his house for his gold-digging girlfriend. She'll be homeless and broken. He laughed as they moved into my bedroom. I handed his girlfriend the property deed. She went pale when she saw whose name was on it. But let me tell you exactly how I heard those words that changed everything. I was standing in the marble-tiled foyer of our Victorian home on Maple Street, my bare feet silent against the cold stone, as I balanced a silver tray of fresh lemonade. The late afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Casting rainbow patterns across the hardwood floors that I had personally selected and paid for 3 years ago. The house felt alive with summer warmth, filled with the sound of laughter drifting from the back patio where my husband George was entertaining his latest business associate. I had been married to George Washington for 7 years. 7 years of building what I thought was our life together in the sprawling house I had inherited from my grandmother. The house that had been in my family for 4 generations. The house where I had spent childhood summers learning to bake bread in the kitchen, where I had helped my grandmother tend to her prize-winning rose garden, where I had dreamed of raising my own children someday. George had moved in after our wedding, his charming smile and ambitious business plans filling the spaces that had once held only memories. He spoke of expanding his real estate development company, of transforming the neighborhood, of building something magnificent together. I believed him. I believed in us. But on that particular Tuesday afternoon, as I approached the French doors leading to the patio, I heard something that made my blood run cold. "She'll never see it coming," George's voice carried clearly through the summer air, thick with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Camilla's got it all planned out. We'll have her out by Friday." I froze, the ice in the lemonade glasses clinking softly as my hands trembled. Through the gap in the partially open door, I could see George leaning back in the wrought iron chair, his feet propped up on the glass-top table like he owned the world. Across from him sat a woman I didn't recognize, tall, blonde, with perfectly manicured nails wrapped around a wine glass filled with the vintage Chardonnay from our wine cellar. This had to be Camilla Brooks, the woman I had been hearing about in whispered phone calls and late-night meetings. The woman George claimed was just another client, another investor interested in his development projects. The woman whose name appeared on restaurant receipts and hotel bills that I had found crumpled in his jacket pockets. "And she'll just leave." Camilla's voice was honey-sweet but sharp underneath, like a blade dipped in sugar. "After 7 years," George laughed, a sound I had once found endearing but now recognized as cruel. "Gabrielle's soft, always has been. She'll cry, maybe throw a few things, but she'll pack her bags and go running back to that pathetic sister of hers in the city. She has nowhere else to go." "What about the house?" Camilla asked, and I caught the hungry edge in her voice. "It's beautiful. The neighborhood is perfect. I can already picture how I'll redecorate the master bedroom. My master bedroom, the room where I had slept as a child when visiting my grandmother. The room where George and I had exchanged private vows on our wedding night. The room where I had cried alone so many nights over the past 2 years as our marriage crumbled. "The house is mine," George said with absolute certainty. "I've been handling all the paperwork for years. Taxes, insurance, maintenance, everything goes through my company. She doesn't even look at the documents anymore. Just signs whatever I put in front of her." That was true. I had trusted him completely, believing that his business expertise was protecting our assets, protecting our future. Every official-looking document he slid across the breakfast table, I signed without question. Property assessments, insurance updates, tax forms. I had assumed they were routine, necessary, boring details that my capable husband was managing for both of us. "She's been completely checked out of everything important for months," George continued, swirling his wine. "Hell, I could probably tell her the house is being fumigated and she'd pack her bags without asking questions. She's that disconnected from reality." Camilla leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And you're sure there won't be any legal complications? I don't want any messy surprises when I move in. Trust me," George said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I've been planning this for over a year. By the time she realizes what's happening, all the paperwork will be finalized. She'll be out, you'll be in, and we'll be free to start our real life together. The lemonade tray slipped from my hands, crashing to the marble floor with a sound like breaking thunder. Glass shattered, ice scattered, and sticky liquid spread across the surface. I had mopped that very morning, but I barely noticed the mess at my feet. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the sudden silence from the patio. Through the door, I saw George and Camilla freeze, their heads turning toward the sound. For a moment, we all existed in a bubble of suspended time, me standing in the wreckage of my trust, them caught in the act of planning my destruction. Then George's eyes met mine through the glass, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, not remorse, but annoyance. Annoyance that I had interrupted his grand planning session. Annoyance that I had discovered their scheme before he was ready to execute it. "Gabrielle," he said, standing and sliding the door open wider. "I didn't hear you come in." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I was seeing my husband clearly for the first time in months. The man I had fallen in love with, the man I had trusted with my heart and my home, was a stranger. A calculating stranger who had been systematically planning to steal my life. "I brought lemonade," I said quietly, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. But I seemed to have made a mess. Camilla stood as well, smoothing her designer dress, and giving me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Gabrielle. I'm Camilla Brooks. George has told me so much about you." "I'm sure he has," I thought, but I simply nodded. "Nice to meet you." "I should go," Camilla said, gathering her purse. "George, we'll continue our discussion later?" "Of course," he replied, walking her to the front door while I stood motionless in the foyer, surrounded by broken glass and the shattered remains of my assumptions. As the door closed behind her, George turned to me with that familiar patronizing smile. "Sorry about that, honey. Business meeting ran long. Let me help you clean this up." But I was already walking away, my bare feet careful to avoid the scattered glass, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just heard. George thought he was 10 steps ahead of me. He thought I was soft, disconnected, easy to manipulate. He had no idea that the woman he was planning to betray had been quietly, carefully, methodically preparing for this moment for longer than he knew. The game was about to begin, and I was already 3 moves ahead, but this story didn't start with broken glass and overheard conversations. The foundation of George's betrayal was built over years, one seemingly innocent manipulation at a time. When I first met George Washington at that charity gala 3 years before our marriage, he was everything I thought I wanted: confident, successful, charming. He owned Washington Development, specializing in historic property renovations. When he learned about my grandmother's Victorian house, his eyes lit up with what I mistook for genuine interest. "Pre-1900 architecture is my specialty," he had said. "I'd love to see it sometime." Within weeks, he was spending every weekend at the house, praising the craftsmanship and original details. "They don't make houses like this anymore," he would say, running his hands along the banister. Looking back, I realize he wasn't admiring the house, he was appraising it. The courtship was masterful manipulation. George never demanded anything directly. Instead, he made suggestions that felt collaborative. "With your tax situation, it might make sense to put the house under my company's LLC for protection," he mentioned casually. "The liability protection alone would save you thousands." I trusted him completely. My grandmother had left me a maze of insurance policies and property taxes that overwhelmed me. George's expertise felt like a gift. "That sounds smart," I replied, signing papers without reading them carefully. "I'm lucky to have someone who understands these things." "I'll always take care of you," he said. "That's what partners do." The wedding was beautiful, a small ceremony in the rose garden. George handled all the logistics, insisting I focus on being beautiful while he managed the details. I thought it was romantic. I didn't realize he was establishing a pattern of control. After the honeymoon, George moved into the house officially, setting up his office in my grandmother's sitting room. Within months, all mail was redirected to his business address. "It's more efficient," he explained. "My accountant handles everything as business deductions." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The explanations always made sense. George presented his gradual takeover as logical, beneficial decisions. When contractors started calling him directly, when the landscaping company sent bills to his office, when even the cleaning lady began checking with George about scheduling, it all seemed natural. "You're always so busy with your museum work," George would say. "I don't want you bothered with mundane stuff." But I began feeling like a guest in my own home. When the kitchen faucet leaked, I found myself asking George who to call. When the air conditioning needed service, I waited for him to schedule it. The most insidious part was how George made me feel foolish for wanting involvement. "You don't need to worry about that," became his standard response. "I've got it handled." If I pressed for details, he would explain things in a tone suggesting I was being unnecessarily anxious. "The property management side is complicated," he would say. "Insurance requirements, tax implications. It's better if you trust me to handle it," and I did trust him. Completely. When he presented routine maintenance contracts requiring my signature, I signed them without reading the fine print. I thought I was being supportive, allowing my husband to use his expertise to protect our assets. I had no idea that with every signature, George was quietly transferring control of my inheritance into his own hands. The house my great-great-grandmother had built was being stolen from me one document at a time, and I was helping him do it. The signs were there from the beginning, subtle as morning mist but just as real. I simply chose not to see them, wrapping each red flag in comfortable explanations, until they became invisible. It started with dinner parties. George loved entertaining, and our Victorian house was perfect for hosting his business associates. The dining room's mahogany table and evening light through bay windows created sophisticated ambiance that made everyone feel important. "Gabrielle throws the most elegant parties," George would announce, his arm around my waist as I served appetizers. "She's got that natural hostess gene." The compliments felt genuine, but they came with subtle corrections. "Maybe a little less salt next time," he would whisper. "Jim's watching his blood pressure." Or "The wine is lovely, but Cabernet would have paired better with the beef." I started second-guessing myself. Had the soup been too salty, should I have consulted George about wine selection? These seemed like reasonable suggestions. George had more experience with business entertaining. The pattern expanded beyond parties. When I chose new curtains, George would say, "They're beautiful, but don't you think burgundy would complement the furniture better?" When I planted flowers, he would mention, "Pink roses are lovely, but white would be more classic for a Victorian home." Each comment was delivered with love, framed as gentle guidance. But slowly, I stopped making decisions without consulting him first. The house that had once reflected my personality began reflecting his preferences. "You're so lucky," my friend Joan Hart said after a dinner party. "George has such refined taste. He's so involved in making your home beautiful. He does have a good eye." I agreed, ignoring the small knot in my stomach. "Sometimes, I think he cares more about the house than I do." "What do you mean?" "Nothing negative. He's just passionate about historic preservation. He notices details I miss." Joan's eyebrows raised slightly. "In your own house?" "Our house," I corrected. "He grew up in apartments. Having a real family home means a lot to him." Joan nodded, but something in her expression suggested she wanted to say more. Instead, she simply said, "Just make sure you don't forget it's your family home too." The comments began extending beyond household decisions. At neighborhood events, George would introduce me as the one who inherited this gorgeous house we live in. "I'm just the lucky guy who gets to help maintain it." The introduction felt wrong, reducing me to my inheritance rather than who I was. When I mentioned it to George, he looked genuinely confused. "I was bragging about you," he said. "Why wouldn't I be proud of that?" I felt foolish for being bothered. George was proud of me, proud of our life together. I should have been grateful. He didn't feel emasculated by my bringing more assets into the marriage. Financial conversations started around our second anniversary. George began mentioning the burden of maintaining such a large property, heating and cooling costs, expensive repairs. "Don't get me wrong," he would say, reviewing bills. "I love this house, but the costs are significant. The new roof alone will run $12,000. I thought your company was handling major repairs as business expenses." "It is, but ultimately, it's our money. I want you to understand what we're dealing with financially." These conversations made me feel guilty, as if my inheritance was a burden George was graciously carrying. I began seeing the house through his eyes, not as a family legacy, but as an expensive responsibility. "Maybe we should consider selling," I suggested after a plumbing emergency. George looked up from his laptop, expression carefully neutral. "If that's what you want. But I hate to see you give up something your grandmother trusted you with." The guilt was immediate and sharp. Selling would be betraying my grandmother's memory. "You're right," I said. "I'm just feeling overwhelmed." "That's why you have me," George said, taking my hand. "I'll handle the financial side. You just focus on making it a home." It was the perfect response, loving and reassuring, but it was also the moment I began abdicating responsibility for my own life, trusting George to manage practical details, while I focused on emotional ones. I didn't realize I was signing away my agency one conversation at a time. The isolation didn't happen overnight. It was like watching a photograph fade, so gradual you don't notice until one day, the image has become unrecognizable. It started with my work at the Metropolitan Heritage Museum, where I had been senior curator of American history for 6 years. I loved the careful research, the satisfaction of bringing historical artifacts to life for visitors. Working with period furniture felt like a natural extension of living in my grandmother's Victorian house. "You're so passionate about your work," George would say, watching me prepare for exhibitions, "but you're always stressed about deadlines and budgets. Maybe it's time to consider whether the museum really values what you bring." The comments were planted like seeds during casual conversations. When I mentioned disagreements with my supervisor, George would nod sympathetically. "It sounds like they don't appreciate your expertise." When I expressed frustration about budget limitations, he would suggest, "Maybe you're too good for a place that can't properly fund your vision." The seeds sprouted when I was passed over for assistant director, in favor of a less experienced colleague with better political connections. I came home devastated, feeling like 6 years of work had been dismissed. "I'm not surprised," George said, holding me as I cried. "You're too talented, too innovative for them. They probably felt threatened by your capabilities." "But I love the work," I sobbed. "Of course you do. But maybe it's time to think about what you really want. You could freelance as a historical consultant. Museums would pay for your expertise. You could work from home, maybe write that book you've always talked about." The idea was seductive. I had always dreamed of writing about Victorian domestic life, but full-time work had never allowed the time. Working from home would mean more time with George, more opportunities to manage the house properly. "It would be risky," I said. "Freelance work is unpredictable." "That's what I'm here for," George replied. "My business is doing well enough to support us both, while you build your practice. Think of it as an investment in your future." The decision to leave felt like my own, but I can see now how carefully George had orchestrated each conversation, each suggestion, each moment of doubt. He never told me to quit. He simply created conditions where quitting felt logical, even empowering. My supervisor tried to dissuade me. "This is a mistake," Dr. Margaret Collins said. "You're one of our most talented curators. The board would have recognized that eventually." "I'm ready for a change," I replied, though the words felt hollow. Dr. Collins studied my face carefully. "Are you sure this is what you want? Because if you're leaving because of the promotion situation—" "No," I interrupted. "This is my decision. I'm excited about the possibilities." But uncertainty grew during my first months of freelance work. Clients were harder to find than predicted. Museums had tight budgets and existing consultant relationships. Historical societies were interested, but couldn't afford my rates. The book remained scattered notes and good intentions. "It takes time to build a reputation," George would say, when I expressed frustration. "You can't expect to replace a full-time salary immediately." As months passed, I became increasingly dependent on George's income. The house's maintenance costs seemed to be increasing, roof repairs followed by electrical work, then plumbing upgrades, then foundation repairs. George claimed were urgent. Maybe I should look for part-time work, I suggested one evening. George looked up from his calculator, expression patient but exasperated. That defeats the purpose of going freelance. You'll be splitting your time and energy. You won't be able to give consulting clients the attention they deserve. But the money? The money is fine, George interrupted. My business is growing. We're not struggling. You just need to be patient. I wanted to believe him, but my savings account was steadily shrinking. I felt like I was drowning in slow motion, watching my financial independence disappear. My social connections began fraying as well. Without daily museum interactions, I realized how much of my social life had been work-related. George's dinner parties centered around his business associates, charming evenings that left me feeling like a supporting character. When I called Joan for lunch, our conversations felt stilted. She was busy with her career and family, while my days, spent alone in the house, felt empty in comparison. How's the consulting business? She would ask, and I would give optimistic answers about building relationships when the truth was I spent most days reading, cleaning, and waiting for George to come home. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, fading into the background of a story where I had once been the protagonist. The breaking point came at the Riverside Country Club's annual Heritage Preservation Gala. After months of isolation, the prospect of dressing up and discussing historical preservation felt like a return to my former self. I wore my grandmother's emerald necklace with a black cocktail dress that made me feel elegant and confident. "You look beautiful," George said, as we entered the ballroom. "Just remember, these people are important to my business. Follow my lead on conversations." The ballroom showcased photographs of restored Victorian homes, including several George's company had worked on. I felt a flutter of pride seeing his work displayed so prominently. The evening started well. I found myself engaged in conversations about architectural preservation, feeling intellectually stimulated for the first time in months. That's when we encountered Stanley Johnson, a prominent real estate attorney, and his wife Lois, an art museum docent. "Gabrielle was telling me about her Victorian house," Lois said. "It sounds incredible." "The Brooks Victorian on Maple Street?" Stanley asked. "One of the finest examples of Queen Anne architecture in the city." "Actually, it's the Washington House now," George interjected smoothly. "We've been working on restoration projects. The property has incredible potential for development." Something cold settled in my stomach. Development. We had never discussed developing the property. Development, Stanley echoed my thoughts. "A house like that should be preserved exactly as built." "Of course," George replied. "But there's significant potential for expansion. The lot is large enough for additional structures, maybe a carriage house conversion, or a guest cottage. The zoning allows for multiple dwellings." I stared at George, feeling like I was hearing a foreign language. Multiple dwellings. Guest cottages. These weren't preservation projects. They were commercial development plans he had apparently been making without consulting me. "What an exciting project," Lois said, turning to me. "Are you planning to do the historical research yourself?" I started, but George cut me off. "Gabrielle's been focusing on other consulting projects. The development side is really my area of expertise. She trusts me to handle the business decisions." The dismissal was swift and complete. In one sentence, George had reduced me from property owner to silent partner, from decision maker to someone who trusts him to handle my own inheritance. "Actually," I said, my voice sharper than intended, "I haven't agreed to any development plans. The house is meant to be preserved as it is." George's smile froze for a moment, a flicker of annoyance I caught but hoped others missed. "Of course, darling. We're still in early planning stages. All decisions are made together." But Stanley was a lawyer, trained to notice subtleties. He looked between us with obvious curiosity, sensing tension beneath the polite surface. "Who holds the deed to the property?" Stanley asked carefully. "We both do," George replied quickly. Everything is joint ownership. Actually, I said, feeling a strange compulsion to correct him, it's in my name. Inherited it from my grandmother. The silence was deafening. George's hand tightened on my arm, fingers digging in just hard enough to send a warning. Lois looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing she had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. Well, Stanley said after a pause, you're lucky to have such a beautiful family legacy to preserve. Indeed, George said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Gabrielle is very fortunate to have inherited such a valuable property. The word fortunate landed like a slap. Not proud, not blessed, not trusted with a family legacy, fortunate. As if my inheritance was luck rather than generations of careful stewardship. As we walked away, George's grip remained firm. What was that about? He asked, voice low but angry. What was what about? Contradicting me in front of Stanley Johnson, making me look like I don't know our own property details. Our property. The words came out before I could stop them. George, it's my house. It's been in my family for 4 generations. His eyes narrowed, and I saw something cold and calculating I had never seen before. Your house that I've been paying to maintain for 3 years. Your house that would be falling apart without my expertise and financial support. The accusation hit like a physical blow. After months of manipulation, George had finally revealed his true thoughts about our arrangement. I wasn't a wife, I was a burden he had been graciously carrying. I never asked you to. You never asked because you never had to. He cut me off. You just assumed I'd handle everything while you played at being a consultant. The cruelty was breathtaking. In a ballroom full of people who respected historic preservation, George had reduced my life's work to playing. He had made clear that he saw my inheritance not as a family legacy to be preserved, but as a business opportunity to be exploited. I stood there in my grandmother's emerald necklace, surrounded by photographs of historic houses saved from destruction, and realized that my own home, my own life was under attack from the person who was supposed to protect it. The woman who had once curated museum exhibitions, who had been trusted with preserving pieces of American history, had been systematically diminished until she couldn't even defend her own property rights. But something shifted in that moment. The cold calculation in George's eyes revealed something important. He wasn't my partner, he was my adversary, and I was about to learn how to fight back. The drive home from the gala was silent, tension crackling between us like electricity before a storm. When we reached the house, George headed straight for the liquor cabinet, pouring himself 3 fingers of bourbon without offering me anything. You embarrassed me tonight, he said finally, not turning to face me. I embarrassed you? By clarifying that I own my own house? George turned, his eyes already glassy. By making me look like I don't know what I'm talking about. By contradicting me in front of potential clients. Potential clients for what, exactly? What are these development plans you've been making without consulting me? Plans to make this place profitable, instead of just a money pit, George snapped. Plans to turn your grandmother's legacy into something that actually generates income. Our bank account. I stared at him, seeing a stranger. George, this is my house, my inheritance, my decision. He laughed bitterly. Your house that I've been subsidizing for 3 years. Your inheritance that would be worthless without my expertise and investment. What investment? What money have you actually put into this house? George's face darkened. Every repair, every improvement, every tax payment has gone through my company. I've been managing this property like a business investment, protecting your assets while you play house. Then maybe you should show me the bills, I interrupted. Maybe I should see exactly where all this money is going. Something flickered in George's eyes, panic that he quickly covered with another sip of bourbon. You don't need to worry about the details. That's what I'm here for. No. I want to see the financial records. I want to know exactly what's been spent on my house. George set down his glass with more force than necessary. Fine. You want to see the records. You want to understand the financial reality of your precious inheritance. He stalked to the desk, pulling out a thick folder and slamming it down. Here, all the records. Every expense, every repair, every improvement. I approached cautiously, heart pounding. The folder contained invoices, receipts, tax forms, insurance papers. George watched with anger and smugness as I began reading. "See," he said, pointing to contractor invoices. 15,000 for roof repair, 8,000 for electrical work, 12,000 for foundation stabilization. That's just this year. The amounts were staggering, but something felt wrong about the documentation. Where did all this money come from? From my business. From Washington development profits. Money I've been reinvesting in this property instead of expanding my company. But why would you spend so much of your own money on my house? George's expression softened slightly. Because I love you. Because I wanted to protect your inheritance. Because I thought we were building something together. The words should have warmed me, but they felt manipulative. I looked back at the papers, trying to make sense of the numbers. That's when I noticed something odd. Several invoices were addressed to Washington Development, LLC, rather than me personally. Insurance documents listed the company as primary policyholder. Even property tax statements showed Washington Development as the responsible party. "George," I said slowly, "why are all these documents addressed to your company instead of me?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers with an unreadable expression. "For tax purposes," he said finally. "It's more efficient to run expenses through the business. But this is my personal residence. These shouldn't be business expenses. It's complicated. There are liability issues, tax implications." "Show me the deed," I interrupted. "What? The property deed? I want to see the actual ownership documents." George's face went pale. "Why would you need to see that? You know you own the house. Then showing me the deed shouldn't be a problem." For a long moment, George didn't move. Then slowly, he reached into the desk's bottom drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. His hands shook slightly as he handed it to me. "Here, but remember, everything I've done has been to protect you. To protect us." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The deed was thick, formal, covered in legal language that made my head spin. But one thing was crystal clear. The property was listed as owned by Washington Development, LLC, with me listed as a beneficial occupant. The room spun as the implications sank in. According to this document, I didn't own my grandmother's house. George's company did. I was nothing more than a tenant with benefits. "What is this?" I whispered. George's face crumpled. "I can explain. It's not what it looks like." But I was already backing away, papers clutched in my hands. "You stole my house. You stole my inheritance." "No," George said desperately. "I protected it. I restructured ownership to protect you from liability, from tax consequences." "You lied to me," I interrupted, my voice growing stronger. "You made me sign papers I didn't understand. You stole my house and made me grateful for it." George's composure finally cracked. "You would have lost it anyway," he shouted. "You had no idea how to manage a property like this. You would have been bankrupt within 5 years." The admission hung between us like a confession. He hadn't protected me, he had taken advantage of me. Every signature, every document, every routine form had been part of a systematic plan to steal my inheritance. But as I stood there holding the deed that had stripped away my birthright, I felt something unexpected: clarity. For the first time in months, I understood exactly what I was dealing with. George Washington wasn't my husband. He was a thief who had been playing a long game, and I had been his unwitting accomplice. The game was about to change. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my grandmother's rocking chair, the deed clutched in my hands, staring out at the garden she had planted 50 years ago. The moon cast silver shadows across the rose bushes, and I could almost hear her voice whispering stories about the strong women who had lived in this house before us. By dawn, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The confused, dependent woman who had gone to the gala was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone cold, calculating, and absolutely determined to reclaim what had been stolen. George had passed out on the library sofa, the empty bourbon bottle beside him. I stepped over him carefully, making my way to his home office. The morning light illuminated stacks of papers, filing cabinets, and the computer where he managed his business affairs. I had never touched his work computer before. George had always been protective of his business documents, claiming they contained sensitive client information. But as I powered up the machine, I realized his secrecy had nothing to do with professional discretion, and everything to do with hiding evidence of systematic theft. The computer wasn't even password protected. George's arrogance had made him careless. He had never imagined his naive wife would investigate his business practices. The desktop was organized into folders labeled with property addresses, including one marked Maple Street Project. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents, architectural plans, development proposals, financial projections, and correspondence with potential investors. The plans were extensive. George intended to divide the property into multiple lots, demolish the original house, and build luxury condominiums. But what made my blood run cold was the timeline. The first document was dated 3 months before our wedding. George had been planning to steal and develop my house since before we were married. Our entire relationship had been built on fraud. I kept reading, horror growing with each document. George had been using my house as collateral for business loans, leveraging my inheritance to fund other development projects. The property taxes and insurance payments hadn't been acts of generosity. They had been investments in his own portfolio. A folder labeled Legal Documents contained copies of all the papers I had signed over 3 years. George had meticulously documented every step of his scheme, including notes about my emotional state when I signed each document. Subject appeared distressed about museum situation. Read one note. Signed transfer papers without reading. Excellent timing. Subject. He had referred to me as a subject in his own notes, like I was a mark in some elaborate con game. I printed everything, every document, every email, every financial projection. The printer ran for over an hour, churning out evidence that George had systematically defrauded me of my inheritance. By the time I finished, I had a stack of papers 3 inches thick. "What are you doing?" George's voice behind me made me turn slowly. "Research," I said calmly. "I'm learning about the Maple Street Project." George's face went white. "Gabrielle, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You've been planning to steal my house since before we were married. You've been using my inheritance as collateral for business loans. You've been documenting your fraud in meticulous detail." "It's not fraud," George said desperately. "It's business. It's protecting our assets. Our assets." I stood up, papers still in my hands. "George, you've been referring to me as the subject in your own notes. You've been treating our marriage like a business transaction." The silence stretched between us, heavy with exposed truth. George's shoulders sagged as he realized there was no point in continuing the charade. "You would have lost it anyway," he said quietly. "You had no business sense, no understanding of property management. At least this way, the value is preserved. For you. The value is preserved for you." George looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the moment he realized something fundamental had changed. The woman standing in front of him wasn't the compliant, trusting wife he had been manipulating for 3 years. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I smiled, and it was the coldest smile I had ever produced. "I'm going to get my house back." That afternoon I drove to Collins, Hart and Associates, and met with Stanley Johnson. When I walked into his office, carrying my stack of documents, he took one look at my face and canceled his afternoon appointments. "Tell me everything," he said. I talked for 2 hours, laying out George's entire deception. Stanley listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he began examining the documents. "This is one of the most systematic cases of spousal property fraud I've ever seen," he said. "Your husband documented his own crimes in remarkable detail. Can we get my house back?" Stanley smiled, a sharp, predatory expression. "Mrs. Washington, by the time we're finished with your husband, you'll own more than just your house, you'll own his entire business." "How?" "Because he used your property as collateral for multiple business loans without your knowledge. That's fraud on a massive scale. When we prove the original transfer was obtained through deception, every transaction becomes null and void. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of fear and helplessness that had been growing tighter for months. What do we do next? We document everything. We build a case so airtight that your husband will have no choice but to settle. And while we're doing that, you're going to continue being the perfect wife. What do you mean? Stanley's smile grew wider. You're going to go home and act like nothing has changed. You're going to be supportive and loving, while we quietly gather every piece of evidence we need to destroy him in court. I understood then what Stanley was proposing. George had played a long game, systematically stealing my inheritance over years. Now it was my turn to play the long game. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The transformation began the moment I walked back into the house that evening. George was in the kitchen, nervously pacing while he waited for me to return from what I had told him was a drive to clear my head. When he saw me, his face lit up with relief, and something that looked almost like hope. "Gabrielle, thank God," he said, rushing toward me. "I've been thinking about everything, and I want to make this right. We can restructure the property ownership. We can—" "Shiss," I said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "I understand now." George blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "You understand?" I nodded, channeling every acting skill I'd never known I possessed. "I understand that you were trying to protect me. I understand that I've been naive about business matters. I understand that you were trying to preserve my grandmother's legacy in the only way you knew how." The relief that washed over George's face was almost comical. He had been prepared for tears, accusations, maybe even legal threats. He wasn't prepared for forgiveness and understanding. "I was," he said, eagerly. "I was trying to protect you. The property transfer was about liability protection and tax advantages. I should have explained it better, but I didn't want to burden you with the technical details." "I know," I said, leaning into his embrace. "I know you love me. I know you love this house. I'm sorry I doubted you." George held me tighter, and I could feel the tension leaving his body. "I love you so much," he whispered into my hair. "I never want to lose you." "You won't," I promised. And that was the truth, just not in the way he thought. Over the next few weeks, I became the perfect wife. I cooked his favorite meals, listened attentively to his business stories, and even began asking questions about his development projects, with what appeared to be genuine interest. "I've been thinking," I said, one evening as we sat in the library, George reviewing contracts, while I pretended to read. "Maybe you could teach me more about the business side of property management. I feel like I've been so disconnected from the practical aspects of homeownership." George looked up from his papers, his expression pleased and slightly patronizing. "I'd love to teach you," he said. "It's about time you understood what goes into maintaining a property like this. Could you show me how you organize all the financial records?" I asked. "I want to understand the systems you've put in place." George was more than happy to demonstrate his organizational methods. He walked me through his filing system, explained his accounting software, and even gave me access to his business calendar, so I could understand the scope of his property management responsibilities. What he didn't realize was that I was memorizing everything, every file location, every password, every system he used to manage what he thought was his growing empire. Stanley had given me a small digital recorder disguised as a pen, and I used it to document every conversation, every explanation, every casual admission of his business practices. "The key to successful property development," George explained one evening, as he showed me architectural plans for other projects, "is controlling the narrative. Property owners often don't understand the full potential of their assets. They get emotional about family history or sentimental value, and they can't see the bigger picture." "Like I was," I said, nodding thoughtfully. "Exactly like you were," George agreed. "That's why I had to take control of the decision-making process. Someone has to be the adult in the room." I smiled and kissed his cheek. "You're so much smarter than I am about these things." The compliment made George preen with pride. My apparent acceptance of his superior business acumen made him careless in ways that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. He began leaving sensitive documents on his desk instead of filing them away immediately. He took phone calls about questionable business practices in my presence, apparently confident that I was too naive to understand their implications. During one particularly revealing conversation with a business partner, George discussed a pattern of targeting property-rich cash-poor widows and divorcees for development deals. "They're emotional decision-makers," he explained, while I folded laundry nearby. "They can be convinced to sign almost anything if you frame it as protecting their legacy." I nearly dropped the shirt I was folding, but I managed to maintain my composure. George was describing a systematic pattern of fraud that extended far beyond my case. He was a predator who specialized in exploiting vulnerable women, and I was just his latest victim. But I was also his biggest mistake. The evidence I was gathering with Stanley's help was becoming overwhelming. Bank records showed that George had been systematically transferring assets from properties he had fraudulently acquired. Email correspondence revealed his plans to demolish and develop not just my house, but several other historic properties owned by women he had targeted. "This is bigger than we thought," Stanley told me during one of our weekly meetings at his office. "Your husband isn't just a con artist, he's running a sophisticated fraud operation. We could probably get the FBI involved if we wanted to." "What do you recommend?" I asked. "We stick to the plan," Stanley replied. "We let him think he's in control while we document everything. When we finally move against him, we want to make sure he can't wriggle out of it through legal technicalities." At home, I continued my performance. I attended George's business dinners, smiling and nodding while he described his various projects to potential investors. I listened to him explain how he had rescued properties from owners who didn't understand their value. I even helped him prepare presentations about the Maple Street project, pretending to be excited about the prospect of turning my grandmother's house into luxury condominiums. "You've really come around on this," George said one evening, as we reviewed the latest architectural plans. "I was worried you'd never understand the vision." "I'm learning to see things through your eyes," I replied, and that was true in a way he would never understand. The most difficult part of the performance was maintaining it in bed. George's physical affection now felt like a violation, knowing what I knew about his true nature. But I endured it, even encouraged it, because I knew that emotional and physical intimacy made him more likely to let down his guard. One night, as we lay together after he had fallen asleep, I stared at the ceiling and thought about my grandmother. She had survived the Great Depression, raised 3 children alone after my grandfather died young, and somehow managed to preserve the family house through decades of financial hardship. She had been strong in ways I was only beginning to understand, and she had trusted me with her legacy, not because she thought I was weak, but because she believed I had the strength to protect it when the time came. George stirred beside me, murmuring something in his sleep about closing the deal. I smiled in the darkness, knowing that he was right about one thing: a deal was about to be closed. Just not the one he expected. 3 weeks into my performance, I had developed a routine that would have impressed any professional investigator. Every morning after George left for his office, I would systematically photograph documents, download files, and organize evidence with the methodical precision of a museum curator cataloging artifacts. The difference was that these artifacts would destroy a man's life instead of preserving history. I had purchased a small safe and hidden it behind a false panel in my grandmother's old wardrobe, a secret compartment I had discovered as a child, but never told anyone about. Inside, I kept copies of everything: financial records, legal documents, recorded conversations, and a detailed timeline of George's fraudulent activities. My consultation meetings with Stanley had evolved into full-scale strategy sessions. We met every Tuesday at a small cafe downtown, far from George's usual business haunts. To anyone watching, we looked like old friends catching up over coffee. In reality, we were building a case that would systematically dismantle George's entire criminal enterprise. "Look at this," I said, sliding a folder across the table during one of our meetings. "I found financial records for 5 other properties he's acquired through similar schemes." Stanley opened the folder and whistled softly. "Margaret Chen, Helen Rodriguez, Dorothy Barnes. These are all elderly women who inherited valuable properties. There's a pattern," I continued, pulling out a handwritten chart I had created. "He targets women who have recently lost their husbands or gone through divorces. Women who own property but lack business experience. He poses as a romantic partner or trusted advisor, gains their confidence, then systematically transfers their assets to his company. This is serial fraud, Stanley muttered, studying the documents. How did you get access to all of this? He showed me, I said simply. He's been so proud of his business acumen that he's been using these cases as teaching examples. He thinks he's educating me about property development, but he's actually confessing to multiple felonies. Stanley leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. The arrogance is breathtaking. He's documenting his own crimes and using them as bragging rights. There's more, I said, pulling out my phone. He's been talking about expanding the operation. He wants to start targeting women in other cities, maybe even other states. He's treating it like a franchise model. I played a recording from the previous week, George's voice clear and confident as he discussed his plans with a potential business partner. The key is identifying the right targets. Recent widows are ideal. They're emotionally vulnerable and often overwhelmed by suddenly having to manage assets they don't understand. You approach them as a helpful advisor, gain their trust, then gradually take control of their decision-making process. Stanley's expression darkened as he listened. This recording alone is enough to put him away for years. But I want more than criminal charges, I said. I want to make sure he can never do this to another woman. What do you have in mind? I pulled out another folder, this one containing financial projections and business plans. George has been leveraging all these fraudulently acquired properties to secure loans for his development projects. If we can prove that the original acquisitions were fraudulent, every loan secured against those properties becomes invalid. Stanley's eyes widened as he understood the implications. He'd be personally liable for millions in defaulted loans. Exactly. And since he's been operating through an LLC, once we pierce the corporate veil and prove fraud, his personal assets become fair game for collection. You've been busy, Stanley said, clearly impressed. My grandmother didn't just leave me a house, I replied. She left me a legacy of strong women who fought for what was theirs. I'm not just fighting for my property, I'm fighting for every woman he's victimized. The evidence collection had become easier as George grew more confident in his deception. He no longer bothered to hide sensitive documents, leaving contracts and correspondence scattered across his desk. He took business calls in my presence, discussing fraudulent activities with the casual confidence of someone who believed his wife was too naive to understand the implications. One evening, while George was showering, I photographed a series of emails between him and his business partner discussing their next target, a recently divorced woman named Sarah Miller, who had inherited a valuable commercial property from her ex-husband. She's perfect, George had written. Emotional, overwhelmed and sitting on a gold mine she doesn't know how to manage. I'm taking her to dinner next week to discuss property management solutions. The email made me physically ill. George was planning to destroy another woman's life while I sat at home pretending to be his loving wife. But it also strengthened my resolve. Sarah Miller didn't know she was being targeted, but I could protect her by ensuring George was in prison before he could execute his plan. I had also begun documenting George's personal expenses, tracking how he used the profits from his fraudulent activities to fund his lavish lifestyle. The expensive dinners, the luxury car payments, the designer clothes, all of it was being paid for with money stolen from vulnerable women. Look at this. I showed Stanley a series of credit card statements during our next meeting. In the past 6 months, George has spent over $50,000 on what he calls business development expenses. But look at the details. Expensive restaurants, jewelry purchases, weekend trips to luxury resorts. He's been using stolen money to fund his affair with Camilla. Stanley studied the statements carefully. This is good. It shows a pattern of using fraudulent proceeds for personal enrichment. It also establishes his relationship with Camilla, which could be relevant if she's been knowingly benefiting from his criminal activities. She knows, I said, with certainty. I've heard them talking about the properties he's acquired. She's been helping him identify targets, using her connections in the real estate industry to find vulnerable women. Then she's a co-conspirator, Stanley said grimly. We can potentially charge her as an accessory to fraud. The thought of Camilla facing criminal charges gave me a satisfaction I hadn't expected. She wasn't just an innocent mistress who had fallen for a married man. She was an active participant in a criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple women's lives. My digital recorder had captured hours of conversations between George and Camilla, including detailed discussions about their plans for my property and their strategy for disposing of me once the transfer was complete. "The wife is finally coming around," George had said during one recorded conversation. "She's been asking about the business, wanting to understand the development process. I think she's accepted that I know what's best for her." "Good," Camilla had replied. "The sooner we can finalize everything, the sooner we can start the real renovation. I've already picked out new furniture for the master bedroom." The casual cruelty of their planning was breathtaking. They were discussing the theft of my inheritance and the destruction of my life with the same tone they might use to plan a vacation. But their confidence was about to become their downfall. Every conversation, every document, every careless admission was being carefully documented and prepared for presentation in court. George thought he was months away from completing his theft. In reality, he was days away from losing everything he had stolen, and everything he had legitimately earned in the process. The trap was nearly set. All I needed now was the perfect moment to spring it. My investigation had revealed the scope of George's crimes, but I knew I couldn't take him down alone. What I needed was a network of allies, people who had the expertise, resources, and motivation to help me dismantle his entire operation. The first ally came from an unexpected source. During one of my evidence-gathering sessions, I had discovered that Margaret Chen, one of George's previous victims, was still alive and living in an assisted care facility across town. According to George's files, he had convinced her to sign over her family's restaurant property 3 years ago, claiming he would help her manage it as a rental investment. Instead, he had sold it to developers who turned it into a parking lot. I drove to Sunset Manor on a rainy Thursday morning, my heart pounding as I approached the front desk. The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Carol, directed me to Margaret's room after I explained I was researching the history of her family's restaurant for a museum project. Margaret Chen was 83 years old, sharp as a tack, and absolutely furious when I explained why I was really there. "That bastard," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "He stole my family's restaurant. 4 generations of my family worked in that building. My grandmother started the business with nothing but a walk and a dream. I'm going to stop him," I told her, showing her some of the evidence I had collected. "But I need your help. I need you to testify about what he did to you." Margaret's eyes lit up with a fire I hadn't expected. "You damn right, I'll testify. That man destroyed my family's legacy. If there's a way to make him pay, I'm in." Margaret introduced me to her daughter, Linda Chen Martinez, who was a forensic accountant specializing in elder abuse cases. Linda had been trying to build a case against George for years, but hadn't been able to access the internal documents needed to prove the fraud. "Your evidence changes everything," Linda said, when we met at her office the following week. "With George's own records and your inside access, we can prove systematic fraud going back at least 5 years." Linda brought another ally into our growing network, Detective Rachel Torres from the Financial Crimes Unit. Rachel had been investigating reports of property fraud targeting elderly women, but hadn't been able to connect the cases until Linda showed her my evidence. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Rachel said, studying the documents spread across Linda's conference table. "We've had complaints about Washington development, but never enough evidence to build a solid case. Your husband has been very careful to stay just within the bounds of civil fraud rather than criminal fraud. Until now," Stanley added. He had joined our meeting to coordinate the legal and criminal aspects of our case. "The recordings and documents Gabrielle has collected show clear intent to defraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. This isn't just civil fraud anymore, it's organized crime." Our team continued to grow. Linda introduced us to Maria Santos, a private investigator who specialized in white-collar crime. Maria had been hired by Helen Rodriguez's family to investigate the suspicious circumstances surrounding Helen's property transfer, but hadn't been able to gather enough evidence to prove George's involvement. "Your husband is smart," Maria explained during our first meeting. He's been very careful to make his fraudulent activities look like legitimate business transactions. But he's also arrogant, and arrogance makes people careless. Maria brought a skill set that complemented our legal and financial expertise. She had contacts in the banking industry who could help us trace the flow of money through George's various accounts. She also had surveillance equipment that could help us document meetings and conversations that might provide additional evidence. "We need to be careful," Maria warned. "If George suspects he's being investigated, he could destroy evidence or transfer assets offshore. We need to move quickly once we're ready to strike." The most unexpected ally came through Margaret Chen's network at the assisted living facility. Dorothy Barnes, another of George's victims, had been living at Sunset Manor for the past year, having lost her home after signing what she thought was a reverse mortgage agreement with George. "He seemed so nice," Dorothy told me when I visited her. "So helpful and understanding. He said he was going to help me stay in my home, but instead he took it away from me." Dorothy's case was particularly heartbreaking because she had been a retired teacher who had saved for decades to pay off her mortgage. George had convinced her that his innovative financing solution would allow her to access her home's equity while continuing to live there. Instead, he had structured the agreement to give himself ownership of the property, while Dorothy became a tenant who could be evicted at any time. "When I couldn't keep up with the monthly payments he started charging me, he said I had to sell," Dorothy explained. "But by then, the house belonged to his company. I got almost nothing from the sale." Dorothy's daughter, Jessica Barnes, was a social worker who had been fighting the system for years, trying to get justice for her mother and other elderly victims of financial abuse. She brought a passion for victim advocacy that energized our entire team. "This isn't just about money," Jessica said during one of our planning meetings. "It's about dignity. It's about protecting vulnerable people from predators who exploit their trust." Our network now included legal expertise, financial analysis, criminal investigation, private detection, and victim advocacy. But we still needed one more element: media attention. Linda suggested we reach out to investigative journalist Amanda Walsh, who had been writing a series of articles about elder abuse in the local newspaper. Amanda had been looking for a case that would illustrate the systematic nature of property fraud, targeting vulnerable populations. "This is the story I've been waiting to tell," Amanda said, when we met at a coffee shop downtown. "Your husband's operation is exactly the kind of sophisticated fraud that flies under the radar, because it looks like legitimate business activity." Amanda brought the promise of public exposure that would ensure George couldn't simply disappear or start over in another city. Her articles would alert other potential victims and put pressure on law enforcement to take action. "We need to coordinate the timing carefully," Stanley advised during our final planning meeting. "Amanda's articles, the criminal investigation, and our civil lawsuit need to hit simultaneously. If we give George any warning, he'll destroy evidence and transfer assets." "How long do we have?" I asked. "Based on the documents you've collected, George is planning to finalize several major transactions within the next month," Linda replied. "If we don't move soon, he'll have liquidated most of his fraudulently acquired properties, and the money will be much harder to recover." Detective Torres nodded. "We're ready to move on the criminal charges. We just need a few more pieces of evidence to make the case airtight." I looked around the table at the faces of the people who had joined my fight. Margaret Chen, still furious about the loss of her family's restaurant. Linda Chen Martinez, determined to use her professional skills to protect other families from suffering the same loss. Detective Torres, committed to bringing a sophisticated criminal to justice. Maria Santos, excited about the challenge of taking down a seemingly untouchable target. Jessica Barnes, passionate about protecting vulnerable people from predators. Amanda Walsh, eager to expose a story that would educate the public about financial fraud. And Stanley Johnson, the lawyer who had seen immediately that George's arrogance had provided us with all the weapons we needed to destroy him. "What's our timeline?" I asked. Stanley smiled, the predatory expression I had come to associate with his confidence in our case. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we bring down George Washington's criminal empire." George thought he was 2 weeks away from completing his theft of my inheritance. In reality, he was 2 weeks away from losing everything he had stolen, everything he had legitimately earned, and his freedom. The hunter had become the hunted, and he had no idea the trap had already been set. The final piece of evidence came from George himself, delivered with the casual arrogance that had defined our entire marriage. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard George's voice from the living room, talking animatedly on the phone. "The timeline is perfect," he was saying, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he had executed the perfect crime. "The wife is completely on board with the development project now. She's even been helping me prepare investor presentations." I froze, my hands stilling on the vegetables I was chopping. Through the doorway, I could see George pacing by the fireplace, his phone pressed to his ear, completely unaware that I was listening. "Camilla, sweetheart, by Christmas we'll have everything finalized," he continued. "The property transfer will be complete, the divorce papers will be filed, and you'll be moving into your new home." My blood turned to ice. Christmas. He was planning to destroy my life at Christmas, just like in the story I had overheard on the patio months ago. The symmetry was cruel and deliberate. I moved closer to the doorway, my grandmother's small digital recorder already in my hand. This conversation was going to be the crown jewel of our evidence collection. No, she won't suspect anything," George was saying. "I've been feeding her just enough information to make her feel involved in the process, but she has no idea what's really happening. She thinks we're planning a future together." A pause, then George's laughter, cold and calculating. "Trust me, by the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. I've structured everything so that she'll have no legal recourse. The property transfer was voluntary, the divorce will be uncontested, and she'll be left with nothing but a few sentimental trinkets." I had to grip the doorframe to keep from staggering. The casual cruelty of his words was breathtaking. He was planning to leave me homeless and penniless, and he was discussing it like a business transaction. "The timing is crucial," George continued. "I'm planning to serve her the divorce papers on Christmas Eve. She'll be so shocked and emotional that she won't think clearly. By the time she recovers enough to consult a lawyer, I'll have transferred all the remaining assets, and you'll be legally established as the primary occupant." Christmas Eve. He was planning to destroy my life on Christmas Eve, when I would be most vulnerable, most isolated, most likely to be overwhelmed by emotion, rather than thinking strategically. "She'll probably cry," George said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "She'll beg me to reconsider, promise to be a better wife, all the usual dramatics. But I'll be firm. I'll explain that I've found someone who actually understands business, someone who can be a real partner in building something significant." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, George describing in detail how he planned to execute what he called the final phase of the operation. He talked about which assets he would allow me to keep live, you enough to rent a small apartment, nothing more, how he would frame the divorce to make it look like a mutual decision, and how quickly he expected me to vacate the house. "She'll be out by New Year's," George concluded, "and we'll start renovations in January. By next Christmas, we'll be hosting parties in our renovated mansion." Our renovated mansion. The house that had been in my family for 4 generations, the house where my grandmother had raised her children and tended her garden, the house that contained a century of memories and love. George was planning to gut it and turn it into a showcase for his stolen wealth. When the conversation ended, I remained in the kitchen doorway for several minutes, trying to process what I had heard. The recording in my hand contained George's complete confession, his detailed timeline, and his admission that the entire marriage had been a fraud designed to steal my inheritance. But more than that, it contained something even more valuable, confirmation that our timing was perfect. George was planning to make his move on Christmas Eve, which gave us exactly 3 weeks to execute our counterattack. I finished preparing dinner mechanically, my mind racing with the implications of what I had learned. When George came into the kitchen, humming cheerfully, I managed to smile and ask about his day. "Great day," he said, kissing my cheek, "some exciting developments on the horizon. I think this Christmas is going to be one to remember." "I hope so," I replied, and meant it more than he could possibly know. That night, I called Stanley from my hidden phone, speaking in whispers from my grandmother's secret room behind the wardrobe. "He's planning to serve divorce papers on Christmas Eve," I told him. He thinks the emotional timing will prevent me from thinking clearly. Perfect, Stanley replied. That gives us our timeline. We'll execute our plan on December 23rd, the day before he planned to destroy you. Will we be ready? We'll be ready. Detective Torres has confirmed that the district attorney is prepared to file criminal charges. Linda has finished tracing all the financial transactions. Maria has documented his meetings with potential investors. Amanda has her articles ready to publish. And I have a lawsuit that will freeze all his assets and put him in personal bankruptcy. What about the other victims? Margaret, Dorothy, and Helen are all prepared to testify. Their stories will demonstrate the systematic nature of his fraud. The judge will see exactly what kind of predator George really is. I closed my eyes, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. George had spent years planning to steal my life, but his arrogance had given us every tool we needed to destroy him. There's one more thing, I said. I want to be there when he realizes what's happening. I want to see his face when he discovers that his victim was actually his hunter. Stanley chuckled. That can be arranged. In fact, I think it's poetic justice. He planned to destroy you on Christmas Eve, so Christmas Eve is when we'll destroy him. And Camilla? She'll be there too. Detective Torres wants to arrest both of them simultaneously. She's been just as involved in the fraud as he has. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of my grandmother's secret room, surrounded by the evidence that would bring down the man who had tried to steal my legacy. The scared, isolated woman who had discovered George's betrayal 4 months ago was gone. In her place was someone stronger, smarter, and absolutely determined to protect not just herself, but every other woman George had victimized. George thought he was 3 weeks away from completing the perfect crime. In reality, he was 3 weeks away from losing everything he had stolen, everything he had legitimately earned, and his freedom. The trap was set, the evidence was gathered. The allies were prepared, all that remained was the execution. And unlike George, I wasn't going to wait until Christmas Eve to deliver my surprise. The final weeks of November passed in a blur of careful choreography. Every detail had to be perfect, every timing synchronized, every participant briefed on their role in what Stanley had started calling Operation Christmas Present. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. George's plan to give me divorce papers as a Christmas gift was about to backfire spectacularly. I had become a master of compartmentalization, maintaining my performance as the devoted wife while secretly coordinating the systematic destruction of my husband's criminal empire. George, meanwhile, had become increasingly smug and affectionate, apparently believing that his manipulation had been so successful that I was now completely under his control. "You know," he said, one evening as we sat by the fireplace, his arm around my shoulders, "I'm really proud of how much you've grown this year. You've become so much more understanding of business realities." "I've learned a lot from you," I replied, and it was true in ways he would never understand. The logistics of our operation were complex. Detective Torres had coordinated with the district attorney's office to ensure that arrest warrants would be ready to execute on December 23rd. The timing was crucial. We needed to move before George could complete any of his planned asset transfers or destroy evidence. Linda Chen Martinez had worked with forensic accountants to trace every dollar that had flowed through George's various accounts. The financial analysis revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been running for nearly 6 years, with my property serving as the centerpiece of his fraudulent empire. The total value of assets acquired through fraud is approaching $8 million, Linda explained during one of our final planning meetings. But because he's been leveraging these properties for additional loans and investments, his actual liability is closer to $15 million. What does that mean for recovery? I asked. It means that when we seize his assets, there will be more than enough to compensate all the victims and pay substantial damages, Stanley replied. George thought he was building wealth, but he was actually building a house of cards that's about to collapse. Maria Santos had been conducting surveillance to document George's meetings with potential investors and his ongoing relationship with Camilla. Her photographs and recordings provided additional evidence of the conspiracy and helped establish the timeline of their plan to dispose of me. They've been house hunting, Maria reported with grim satisfaction, looking at properties in the Bahamas where they plan to relocate after liquidating everything here. George has been telling people he's planning to retire early and move abroad with his new wife. The media strategy was equally important. Amanda Walsh had prepared a series of articles that would run in the major newspapers, starting December 24th, ensuring that George's crimes would become public knowledge just as the criminal and civil cases were filed. The articles would also serve to warn other potential victims and encourage anyone else who had been defrauded to come forward. I've been investigating property fraud for years, Amanda explained. But George's operation is the most sophisticated I've ever seen. His story is going to change how people think about this type of crime. The victim impact statements were particularly powerful. Margaret Chen had written a detailed account of how George had convinced her to sign over her family's restaurant, describing the emotional devastation of losing a business that had been in her family for 4 generations. Dorothy Barnes had documented how George's reverse mortgage scheme had left her homeless and penniless after decades of careful saving. Helen Rodriguez's daughter had prepared a statement about the impact on her mother's final years, explaining how George's fraud had forced a proud woman to spend her last months in a nursing home instead of her own home. These statements will ensure that George receives the maximum sentence, Detective Torres assured us. Judges take elder abuse very seriously, especially when it involves systematic fraud over multiple years. But the most crucial element of our setup was ensuring that George and Camilla would be exactly where we needed them to be on December 23rd. Through careful manipulation of conversations, I had convinced George that we should host a small dinner party that evening to celebrate the completion of his latest business deal. It would be nice to have a few friends over, I had suggested. Maybe Stanley and his wife, since he's been so helpful with the legal aspects of the property development. And you could invite Camilla. I'd like to meet this business partner I've heard so much about. George had been delighted by the suggestion. That's a wonderful idea, he had said. It'll be the perfect way to celebrate everything we've accomplished this year. The guest list was carefully curated. Stanley would be there in his capacity as my attorney, ready to serve George with the civil lawsuit. Detective Torres would be stationed outside, ready to execute the arrest warrants. Maria would be in position to document everything, and Amanda would be present to witness the culmination of her investigation. What about Camilla? I had asked during our final planning session. How do we ensure she shows up? Stanley smiled. Leave that to me. I've prepared a special invitation that I think she'll find impossible to resist. As December 23rd approached, I found myself experiencing a strange sense of calm. The terrified, confused woman who had overheard George's original plan 6 months ago was gone. In her place was someone who had learned to be strategic, patient, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. George had taught me well, though not in the way he had intended. He had shown me how to hide my true intentions, how to manipulate conversations to gather information, how to plan for the long term while maintaining a facade of innocence. Now I was going to use all those skills against him. The final preparations were completed on December 22nd. The dinner party was planned for 7 p.m. on December 23rd. George was expecting a celebration of his successful fraud. Instead, he was going to get a front-row seat to the destruction of everything he had built on the foundation of stolen lives. I spent that last evening looking through my grandmother's photo albums, studying the faces of the strong women who had come before me. They had survived wars, depressions, and personal tragedies. They had built lives of meaning and purpose despite facing obstacles that would have broken weaker people. George had made a crucial mistake when he targeted me. He had assumed that because I was trusting and naive, I was also weak. He had confused kindness with stupidity, generosity with gullibility. Tomorrow he would learn the difference. The trap was set, the stage was prepared. The curtain was about to rise on the final act of George Washington's criminal career, and I was ready to take my bow. December 23rd arrived with a blanket of fresh snow that made the Victorian house look like something from a Christmas card. I spent the morning preparing for the dinner party with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized my entire investigation. Every element had to be perfect: the table setting, the menu, the timing of each revelation. George was in an exceptionally good mood, humming Christmas carols as he dressed for the evening. He had no idea that this would be his last night as a free man. "I'm excited for you to finally meet Camilla properly," he said, adjusting his tie in the bedroom mirror. She's been looking forward to getting to know you better.
I'm sure she has, I replied, fastening my grandmother's pearl necklace. The same pearls that had been in my family for 3 generations. The same pearls that George had been planning to let Camilla wear, after disposing of me.
The guests began arriving at 7 o'clock sharp. Stanley came first, carrying a leather briefcase that contained the civil lawsuit. He was followed by Detective Torres, who was posing as Stanley's wife for the evening. Maria Santos had positioned herself across the street with surveillance equipment, ready to document whatever happened. Camilla arrived last, looking stunning in a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who believed she was about to inherit a fortune, completely unaware that she was walking into a trap.
Gabrielle, she exclaimed, embracing me warmly.
I'm so excited to finally have a proper conversation. George talks about you constantly.
I'm sure he does, I said, noting how her eyes immediately began cataloging the valuable antiques in the foyer.
Welcome to my home. The dinner conversation was surreal. George played the perfect host, regaling our guests with stories about his various business ventures. Camilla nodded along enthusiastically, occasionally making comments that revealed her intimate knowledge of his operations. Stanley and Detective Torres asked probing questions that appeared casual but were actually designed to elicit admissions. This house is absolutely gorgeous, Camilla said as we served the main course. The restoration possibilities are incredible. You could really transform this place into something spectacular. Transform it how? I asked innocently. Well, obviously you'd want to modernize the kitchen, maybe add some contemporary elements to balance the Victorian architecture, and the grounds have so much potential for expansion. George beamed with pride. Camilla has such a vision for historic properties. She sees possibilities that most people miss.
Like what?
Detective Torres asked, playing her role perfectly. Multiple revenue streams, Camilla replied enthusiastically. You could convert the carriage house into rental units, maybe add a small commercial space. The zoning allows for mixed-use development. I felt a cold satisfaction as Camilla unknowingly confessed to conspiracy in front of a police detective. Every word she spoke was being recorded, every admission carefully noted. That sounds expensive, Stanley observed. Who would finance such extensive renovations?
George's chest puffed with pride.
That's the beauty of proper property management. When you structure ownership correctly, you can leverage one property to fund improvements to another. It's all about maximizing the return on your asset portfolio.
Your asset portfolio? I asked, my voice carefully neutral.
Well, our asset portfolio, George corrected quickly. But you know what I mean, you've never been interested in the business side of things. The moment had arrived. I excused myself from the table, ostensibly to check on dessert, but actually to retrieve the folder I had hidden in the kitchen. When I returned, I placed it on the table next to George's wineglass.
What's this? He asked, his voice suddenly cautious.
Just some documents I thought you might find interesting, I said, settling back into my chair. I've been doing some research into property ownership and development rights. George opened the folder, and I watched his face carefully as he began to read. The first document was a copy of the original deed to the house, the one that clearly established my ownership. The second was a legal analysis of the fraudulent transfer documents he had tricked me into signing. Gabrielle, George said slowly, his voice tight with warning.
What is this?
The truth, I replied calmly. The truth about who actually owns this house. The truth about your systematic fraud. The truth about your plan to steal my inheritance and leave me with nothing.
Camilla looked between us, confusion clouding her features.
George, what's she talking about? She's talking about the fact that you've been planning to move into a house that doesn't belong to him, Stanley said, speaking for the first time since the documents had been revealed. She's talking about the fact that you've both been participants in a criminal conspiracy to defraud multiple elderly women of their property. The color drained from George's face as he realized that Stanley wasn't just a dinner guest, he was my attorney. You planned this, he whispered. Just like you planned to serve me divorce papers on Christmas Eve, I replied. The only difference is that my plan actually worked. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. George stared at the documents in his hands as if they might spontaneously combust, while Camilla looked back and forth between us like a spectator at a tennis match who had suddenly lost track of the score. You don't understand, George said finally. His voice strained. These documents are complicated. The property transfers were for tax purposes, liability protection. I understand perfectly, I interrupted, pulling out my phone. In fact, I understand so well that I've been recording our conversations for months. I pressed play on the audio file I had prepared, and George's own voice filled the dining room. The wife is completely on board with the development project now. She's even been helping me prepare investor presentations. By Christmas, we'll have everything finalized. The property transfer will be complete, the divorce papers will be filed, and you'll be moving into your new home.
Camilla's wineglass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor.
George, you told me she knew about us. You said she was okay with the divorce. She is okay with it, George said desperately.
Aren't you, Gabrielle?
We can work this out.
We can restructure the arrangements.
The only thing being restructured, Stanley interrupted, is your life.
Detective Torres.
Detective Torres stood and pulled out her badge. George Washington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse and racketeering. Camilla Brooks, you're under arrest as an accessory to fraud and conspiracy. George's face went white as he realized that one of our dinner guests was actually a police officer. This is entrapment, he stammered.
You can't do this.
Actually, we can, Detective Torres replied, pulling out handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it, but George wasn't finished. As the reality of his situation sank in, his shock transformed into rage. You think you're so smart, he snarled at me. You think you've won something? You'll never be able to manage this property without me. You'll lose everything anyway. Actually, I said, pulling out another folder. I've already managed quite well. While you were planning my destruction, I was building my own empire. I opened the folder to reveal documents that George had never seen before. Property deeds, business licenses, financial statements, all bearing my name, all legitimate, all profitable. You see, George, while you were teaching me about property development, I was actually learning. I started my own consulting business, a real one this time. I've been advising other women who were targeted by predators like you. I've been helping them protect their assets and recover their stolen property. George's mouth fell open. That's impossible. You don't have that kind of expertise. I learned from the best, I replied coldly. I learned from you. Every technique you used to manipulate me, every strategy you employed to steal from elderly women, I documented it all and turned it into a business model for protecting potential victims. Stanley smiled and added, Gabrielle has been remarkably successful. Her consulting firm has prevented over $2 million in fraud in just the past 6 months. She's become quite the expert on property crime. But there's more, I continued, savoring the moment. You remember Margaret Chen, don't you? The elderly woman whose family restaurant you stole. George's eyes widened with recognition and growing horror. Margaret's daughter Linda is a forensic accountant. She's been tracking every transaction you've made for the past 5 years. Every fraudulent transfer, every illegitimate loan, every penny you've stolen from vulnerable women. I pulled out a thick document and placed it in front of George. This is the financial analysis of your criminal enterprise. You've stolen $8.2 million from elderly women, but you've also borrowed against those stolen properties. Your total liability is just over $15 million. Camilla, who had been silent since the arrests began, suddenly found her voice. 15 million. George, you told me you were worth millions. You said we'd be rich. We would have been, George said bitterly, if she hadn't interfered. Actually, I said, pulling out one final document, you would have been bankrupt anyway. This is a forensic analysis of your legitimate business operations. Washington Development has been losing money for 3 years. The only thing keeping you afloat was the constant influx of stolen assets. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden my grandmother had planted. You see, George, you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that because I was trusting, I was also stupid. You confused kindness with weakness. I turned back to face him, meeting his eyes directly. But the women in my family have been survivors for generations. We've faced wars, depressions, and men who thought they could steal our lives. We've always found ways to fight back. George stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. The compliant, naive wife he had been manipulating for years was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. You planned this from the beginning, he whispered. No, I replied. You planned this from the beginning. I just learned how to plan better. Detective Torres finished reading the Miranda rights and began leading George and Camilla toward the door. As they passed me, Camilla looked back with tears in her eyes. I really thought he loved me, she said quietly. He loved what you could give him, I replied, just like he loved what he could take from me. As the door closed behind them, I stood in the foyer of my grandmother's house, my house, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete and absolute peace. The trap had been sprung, the predator had been caught. The stolen lives were about to be restored, and I was just getting started. The house felt different after the police cars pulled away, their red and blue lights fading into the snowy night. Stanley and I sat in the living room, surrounded by the scattered evidence of George's downfall, while the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. How do you feel? Stanley asked, pouring himself a glass of the wine that George had selected for our celebration dinner. Empty, I said honestly. For months everything I did was focused on this moment. Now that it's over, I'm not sure what comes next. What comes next is justice, Stanley replied, and recovery, both for you and for George's other victims. My phone had been buzzing constantly since the arrests. News of George's criminal enterprise was already spreading through the local business community. Amanda Walsh's first article had gone online within an hour of the arrests, and the story was being picked up by newspapers across the state. Look at this, I said, reading from my phone. The headline is Local Developer Arrested in Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Scheme. Amanda didn't hold back. Stanley read over my shoulder. She's done excellent work. This story is going to make it impossible for George to claim he was just a misunderstood businessman. The phone rang, and I recognized Margaret Chen's daughter Linda on the caller ID. Gabrielle, Linda's voice was thick with emotion. I just saw the news. Is it true? Did they really arrest him? It's true, I confirmed. George and Camilla are both in custody. The fraud scheme is officially exposed. My mother is crying, Linda said. She's been waiting 3 years for this day. She never thought she'd see justice. Tell her this is just the beginning, I replied. Stanley says the asset recovery process will start immediately. Everyone who was defrauded will get their money back. After I hung up, Stanley pulled out his laptop and began showing me the financial projections for the asset recovery. George's properties will be seized and sold at auction. The proceeds will be distributed to the victims based on the amount each one lost. What about the properties he legitimately owned? I asked. Those will be sold too, to pay the damages and legal fees. George is going to lose everything. His business, his personal assets, even his retirement accounts. I thought about George sitting in a jail cell, probably still trying to figure out how his perfect plan had gone so wrong. He really believed he was smarter than everyone else. Narcissists always do, Stanley replied. They can't conceive of being outmaneuvered by people they consider inferior. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. When I answered it, I found Dorothy Barnes's daughter Jessica standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry to bother you so late, Jessica said, but I had to thank you in person. My mother has been so depressed since she lost her house. When I told her about the arrests, she smiled for the first time in months. Come in, I said, leading her to the living room. Stanley was just explaining the asset recovery process. Jessica sat down heavily in my grandmother's armchair. I never thought we'd see justice, Mom kept saying that men like George Washington were too powerful to be stopped. Your mother was wrong, Stanley said gently. Men like George are only powerful when their victims are isolated and afraid. Once their victims start working together, the predators become vulnerable. What happens now? Jessica asked. Now we rebuild, I replied. George's victims get their money back, and we make sure this never happens to anyone else. As Jessica left, she turned back at the door. You know what the best part is? George thought he was so clever, planning to destroy your life at Christmas. Instead, you gave all of us the best Christmas present we could have asked for, justice. After she left, Stanley and I returned to the living room. The fire was dying down, and the house was settling into its familiar nighttime sounds. For the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful rather than threatening. What are you going to do with the house? Stanley asked. I looked around at the Victorian architecture George had coveted, the antique furniture he had planned to sell, the family photographs he had intended to discard. I'm going to restore it, I said. Not the way George wanted to restore it, but the way my grandmother would have wanted. I'm going to turn it into something that helps people. What do you mean? I'm thinking about a resource center for women who've been victims of financial fraud, a place where they can get legal advice, financial counseling, and emotional support. George taught me that predators target isolated women, so I'll create a place where women don't have to face these battles alone. Stanley smiled. Your grandmother would be proud. I think she would, I agreed. She always said that the women in our family were survivors. I'm finally understanding what she meant. As Stanley gathered his papers and prepared to leave, I walked him to the door. The snow was still falling, covering the tracks left by the police cars and creating a clean slate for whatever came next. Thank you, I said, for everything. For believing me, for helping me fight back, for giving me the tools to reclaim my life. Thank you, Stanley replied, for showing me that sometimes the victim is stronger than the predator realizes. After he left, I stood in the foyer of my house, truly my house now, and felt the weight of generations of strong women who had faced their own battles within these walls. George had tried to steal my legacy, but instead he had helped me discover my own strength. The predator had been caught, the victims would be restored, and I was finally free to build the life I wanted, surrounded by the memories of the women who had taught me that survival was just the beginning. The months following George's arrest passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and personal reconstruction. By spring, the full scope of his criminal enterprise had been exposed, and the victims' stories had sparked a statewide investigation into property fraud targeting elderly women. George's trial began in March, and I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with Margaret Chen, Dorothy Barnes, and Helen Rodriguez's daughter. Watching him in his orange jumpsuit, looking smaller and more pathetic than I had ever seen him, I felt no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of justice being served. The defendants systematically targeted vulnerable women, the prosecutor declared during closing arguments. He exploited their trust, stole their life savings, and destroyed their sense of security. This wasn't just fraud, it was a calculated campaign of psychological and financial abuse. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. George was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 8 years. Camilla, who had agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence, received 3 years. Justice has been served, Margaret Chen said as we left the courthouse. But more importantly, other women won't have to suffer what we suffered. The asset recovery process had been remarkably successful. Stanley's team had traced and seized over $10 million in fraudulent proceeds, allowing full restitution to all victims with additional damages for their suffering. Dorothy Barnes was able to buy back her family home from the developers who had purchased it. Margaret Chen's family recovered enough money to open a new restaurant in honor of their grandmother's legacy. My own financial situation had improved dramatically. The consulting business I had started during my investigation had grown into a thriving practice specializing in financial fraud prevention. I was now working with law enforcement agencies across 3 states, training investigators to recognize the warning signs of property fraud and helping potential victims protect themselves. The Victorian house had been transformed as well, though not in the way George had envisioned. The first floor now housed the offices of the Chen Washington Foundation for Elder Protection, named in honor of Margaret Chen's courage in coming forward. The foundation provided free legal services, financial counseling, and emotional support to elderly victims of financial abuse. "Your grandmother would be amazed," Joan Hart said during one of her visits. "You've turned her house into something that helps dozens of families." "I think she always knew it would be used for something important," I replied. "She just trusted me to figure out what that would be." The garden had been restored to its original beauty, with new plantings that honored both my grandmother's memory and the other victims who had found justice. A small memorial garden featured stones engraved with the names of women who had lost their homes to fraud, serving as a reminder that their stories mattered. Amanda Walsh's investigative series had won several journalism awards and had been optioned for a television documentary. "Your story has changed how people think about financial fraud," she told me during our final interview. "It's shown that victims can fight back and win." On the first anniversary of George's arrest, I hosted a dinner party in the same dining room where his criminal empire had crumbled. The guests included all the women whose lives he had tried to destroy, along with their families and the professionals who had helped bring him to justice. "A year ago we were all victims," I said, raising my glass. "Tonight we're survivors, advocates, and friends. George Washington tried to steal our lives, but instead he taught us how strong we really are." The transformation was complete. The house that had been targeted for destruction was now a beacon of hope. The woman who had been marked as a victim had become a protector of others, and the predator who had thought himself untouchable was spending his days in a concrete cell, forgotten by everyone except the justice system that had finally held him accountable. 5 years later, I stood in the same spot where I had once overheard George's betrayal, but now the house echoed with different sounds: the voices of women seeking help, the clicking of keyboards as counselors drafted legal documents, the gentle conversations of support groups meeting in what had once been George's office. The Chen Washington Foundation had grown beyond anything I had imagined. We had helped over 300 women recover stolen assets, prevented an estimated $50 million in fraud, and trained law enforcement officers in 12 states. The Victorian house had become a symbol of resilience, its rooms filled with hope instead of deception. Margaret Chen, now 88, served as our honorary board chair. Her new restaurant had become a gathering place for the foundation's volunteers, and she still insisted on personally cooking for our major events. "Food brings people together," she would say, ladling soup into bowls. "It heals hearts that have been broken." Dorothy Barnes had returned to teaching, volunteering at the foundation's financial literacy workshops. "I never thought I'd be grateful for what happened to me," she told new clients. "But if my story helps even one person avoid George's trap, then it wasn't for nothing." The most unexpected development had been my personal life. Dr. Michael Torres, Detective Rachel Torres's brother, had joined the foundation as our staff psychologist. What started as professional collaboration had slowly grown into something deeper. He understood the work we did, respected the mission we served, and never once made me feel like I needed to be anything other than exactly who I was. "You've built something extraordinary," he said one evening, as we walked through the memorial garden. "Your grandmother would be proud." "I think she knew I'd figure it out eventually," I replied, touching the stone that bore her name. "She always said the women in our family were survivors." George had been released on parole after serving 8 years, but he had faded into obscurity. Last I heard, he was working as a night security guard in another state, his real estate license permanently revoked, his name synonymous with fraud in the industry he had once dominated. Camilla had moved to California after her release, reportedly working as a waitress and living in a studio apartment. The woman who had once coveted my grandmother's house now struggled to pay rent on a space smaller than our garden shed. As for me, I had found something George never understood. True wealth wasn't measured in stolen assets or fraudulent profits. It was measured in lives restored, families reunited, and the knowledge that every woman who walked through our doors would leave stronger than when she arrived. The house stood as proof that some things cannot be stolen, dignity, strength, and the unbreakable bonds between women who refuse to let predators define their worth. George Washington had tried to steal my life. Instead, he had taught me how to save others, and that I knew was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.